So welcome everybody to this afternoon's gathering where we celebrate the 40th anniversary of Eremos. So my name is Bethany South. I'm the current chairperson of Eremos, and I would like to begin by acknowledging all the past and present council members of Eremos over the last 40 years who have served in oversight and governance of this organisation. So I pay my respect to past and present and future council members. So I have also invited you to post into the chat function the land on which you're situated today as we do an acknowledgement of country. So as we gather together today, far and wide, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet and their connections to land, water and community. And we acknowledge them as the oldest living culture in the world. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and the hopes, and they continue the cultural and spiritual connections to country. We also acknowledge the consequences and the impact of Western settlement for the peoples, communities and our nation. And we would stand together with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders of today and tomorrow, recognising their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So with that, I would like to invite Ian to speak to us and guide us through this afternoon's technical aspects. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks for that, Bethany. Welcome, everybody. A couple of just really short notes on this one for those of you who are less familiar with Zoom. For the purposes of today, because we've got a key panel hosted by Meredith that will be digging into some really interesting conversations, it would probably be best to mute your microphone so we don't get background noise, and also turn off your video camera as suggested, and we'll try to create a presenter view that highlights those presenters then, and that's better for recording purposes as well. If you know how to do it, you can toggle in your views between gallery and speaker. For the key presentation pieces, speaker view is recommended, and then about at a certain point we're going to open up breakout rooms so you get a chance to converse with some of your colleagues, and when you do that, unmute your microphone, turn on your camera, and use gallery view is the best suggestion. I'll post just a reminder of that into the chat line at the moment. And I'll also post, for those of you very, very new to Zoom, some instructions that you can download from the chat box, and I'll give you a bit of guidance about where toolbars are. And if that makes sense to everybody, feel free to enjoy that session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian, for your tips and tricks for using Zoom. To also say that Ian and I both have the power to mute you. So if you should forget to mute yourself and we hear that dog barking next door or the lawnmower of your neighbor, we will mute you, but hopefully we'll all be managing that fine ourselves. It is my privilege to introduce the host of today's event, Dr. Meredith Lake. Dr. Meredith Lake is a presenter, historian, and broadcaster interested in how Australians understand the big questions of faith and meaning. Her most recent book, The Bible in Australia, A Cultural History, has won 4 awards, including the Prime Minister's Literary Award. You may know her as the host of Soul Search on ABC Radio National, a weekly show about lived experience of religion and spirituality. I am very grateful for Meredith's interest in the Eremos story, and it's really been a delight to collaborate her in shaping this event. Meredith's enthusiasm, curiosity, knowledge, and intellectual interests are vast. I am sure we will see them in action today. Thank you, Meredith,
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kate, and to everyone for inviting me today. I'm at home on Gadigal country, which is the Gadigal are one of the clans of the Eora Nation, who were among the clans to bear the heaviest brunt, actually, of the arrival of European colonists who brought with them, as we all know, their version of the Christian gospel. So it's a joy to be with you. Thank you so much. We're here, as has already been said, to celebrate and reflect on the last 40 years, on Eremos, on the questions that have animated this community, and I hope too to think about where those questions might lead us today. As I understand Eremos, this is a group curious about the spiritual possibilities of life and community here in this place, the land we now call Australia, dedicated to exploring the spiritual yearnings and practices of people here. I know that this is a group that's meant a lot to the people who've been involved with it over those many years. I had the privilege of seeing some of the comments that people submitted when they registered for today, describing Eremos as a place for meaningful conversation, a place for deep listening, for stillness, a life-giving community, a group for nurture, challenge, discovery, a group willing to be changed by discoveries of faith. So I think we've got a wonderful afternoon ahead of us as we reflect on what's become of Eremos and what might yet become of this group. And we're going to kind of break our time together into three kind of main parts. So to give you a kind of an overview, if you like, of our journey, first of all, we're going to spend a bit of time thinking about Eremos in the last 40 years, the beginnings and journeys that have already been undertaken. And that section will feature an interview with Don Meadows in just a moment. Then we're going to move into a time of reflection on our current context, our current moments, and that will take the form of a panel featuring Benjamin O and Celia Kemp, who I'll introduce very soon. Then there'll be a stretch break. So if you need a cup of tea, don't worry, there's going to be time if you need to get up and move around or whatever you need to do. And then, as Kate and Bethany have already flagged, there'll be a time for breakout rooms. That is small group discussions, which I will attempt to scoop up and kind of gather into some closing reflections at the end. We're also going to enjoy some readings, a chance to ask questions, to interact with one another. So I really do think we have a really wonderful afternoon ahead of us. If you haven't already indicated that you're here, if there's someone you want to say hello to, the chat box is open. It's going to be open all day. Please use it. Share whose land you're on, and at any time, if a reflection or a question comes to mind as you're listening to people around you, please do post your questions and comments into the chat box, because it'll be a great way to kind of have a dialogue despite there being so many of us here today. So to begin with, let me introduce our kind of companions and guides for the afternoon, beginning with Don Meadows, who will be very well known to many of you, perhaps to all of you, as one of the founders of Eremos back in 1982, alongside Bruce Wilson and Colin Alcock. At that time, Don was the rector of the Anglican parish of St Stephen's in Newtown here in Sydney, afterwards moving to the Diocese of Melbourne, where, as many of you will know, he was an active priest until the late 90s. Retraining as a psychotherapist, a soul doctor in a way. He practiced in that field for 20 years, including as editor of the Australasian Journal of Psychotherapy. He's retired now. John, hello. You're joining us, I believe, from the Central Coast in New South Wales.
Yes, Meredith, I'm here on the Central Coast. I think of it as the Costa Lantana.
Okay. Beginning, how did you come to be involved with Eremos?
It was all Bruce Wilson's fault. He asked me if I would like to be part of it, and I said yes. We've been mates for a long time, and yeah. So he really is the one who started it. And he pulled me into things fairly soon after he got back from England. Yeah.
Wonderful. We will explore a bit more the story of Eremos and what's happened since that collaboration 40 years ago in a moment. But I'd also like to introduce now our other panelists today, beginning with Celia Kemp. Hi, Celia.
Hi.
Celia is a writer, a theologian. She's coming to us today from Aranda country in Central Australia. And her particular passions are scripture, lay monasticism, and a theology rising from place. She holds a pattern of small circles close to the ground, including morning prayer, Bible studies, and retreats. She's also the leader of Streams in the Desert, which is an emerging ecumenical Christian community. She's an author, a photographer. I won't list all her publications. They're there on the event page for this afternoon's meeting. But she's previously worked as a lawyer in coronial and criminal law and as the reconciliation coordinator for the Anglican Board of Mission. So I think there's lots we can learn from Celia. Hello and welcome. To begin with, Celia, you're in the desert in a way today, and Eremos, of course, means desert place or wilderness. I wonder if you'd just share a few initial thoughts on what the desert has to offer spiritual life at this point, either your own spiritual life or more broadly.
I feel brave saying this to people who've been thinking about this before I was born, but in anywho, it's meant a huge amount to me. I was drawn here by illness, but I guess in thinking about it, I think there's something about the people of place becoming like the place. And so the desert is a spacious place, and I think it leads to a spaciousness in people's lives and in people's interior life particularly. I think the desert's a truthful place and reveals both the bad and the good, but it's not a place where it's easy to continue to live in illusions. And I think it's a place where prophets come from and they have slightly spiky speech, and there are many landscape prophets in Australia, First Nations and otherwise. And I think in a world which is ridiculously busy and swarming with lies, and where we are sort of flooded with polished sort of nice speech, the desert is as important as it ever was.
I think when A.D. Hope wrote that poem, Australia, the possibility of whether prophets might come from the desert, well, it was a question as much as a stated fact. And I think that might be something we can explore this afternoon about the role of the desert, the place of the prophetic in our lives together. But I'd also like to introduce this afternoon Benjamin O, who is also with us as a panelist. He is a community worker, an organizer, an advocate, and adult educator. Over the last few years, he's, again, like Celia, worked in many different fields, including human rights, interfaith dialogue, and HIV/AIDS prevention, international aid and development, religious reform, and spiritual formation. One of his particular interests is where those areas intersect with LGBTQ realities and rights. Benjamin also works as a pastoral supervisor for religious leaders, and sometimes even serves as a celebrant over the weddings and life ceremonies of his beloved community. Welcome, Benjamin. It's really great to be with you. There's lots I could ask you, but Eremos, I think it's fair to say, has attracted many people who've found themselves on the fringes of institutional religion. What would you say, drawing on your own experience, about being displaced or on the edge?
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I think as a migrant myself, as someone who comes from multiple cultural identity, and then having to also adopt new identities or adapt to new identities, you see things as an outsider as well as an insider. I think one of the most powerful thing about living, or at least being in a liminal space, an intersecting space, it's you sometimes see reality like not what other people see, because you see truth in a way that is multidimensional. They are not necessarily one way or the other. And I think there's something about those who live or are able to navigate in these spaces. I think they see reality as it is, as a reality. and not necessarily needing to be optimistic or pessimistic. Something about the place in the margins, the fringe, it becomes, or the place of exile, the place of the desert. It becomes a religious demilitarized zone, a DMZ of its sort, where all that noise and wars, different cultural wars, it's not as important. The liminal minoritized spaces become intersectional places of deep personal holiness, and it becomes in some ways holy spaces for others. It's places that if you dare to touch your own suffering, as you're open to the suffering of others, something about your heart and your eyes gets broken open, widened, becomes free, something like the desert. Then you become sanctuaries of freedom, and you no longer need to be addicted to certainty, to absolutes, to dogmatism, to binaries, to dualism. And you find this sanctuary of freedom for others as you do for yourself, and divine hospitality and radical love. That's that possibility.
I'm just waiting for a plane to fly over my house. Perhaps you can hear it. That's a very beautiful phrase, sanctuaries of freedom, both for self and others. And I already, in our conversation today, we've got ideas around truthfulness, around marginality as a place both for discovery and for meeting, which I find very fascinating. And I hope that over the course of our time this afternoon, we'll be able to hear more of each other's stories and probe some of those ideas and what their significance might be for each of us and ourselves, but also for our communities. Before we move into that, though, I would like to. The focus of this session, as I said, is going to be on Eremos and its story so far. So, Don, it would be wonderful if I could ask you a few more questions about the organisation that we're celebrating today on its 40th anniversary. You said just a moment ago that it's really all Bruce Wilson's fault, and he kind of initiated this in conversation with you. But apart from that interpersonal spur to the group, what was the hunger or the yearning that you registered that kind of prompted or led to the birth of Eremos?
Well, I think perhaps the easiest way is to tell you a little yarn about an incident that happened in Bruce Wilson's last year at Theological College, where the head of the college had the fourth year boys in as a kind of a farewell thing. And he said, he being the head of the college at the time, that it is all about learning to love the Bible. And Bruce got up and said, I always thought it was about learning to love God, and walked out. And this is a startling kind of thing, but it really shows up what was going on even before he got out of college and went to work in parishes. I took a bit longer to reach that point. We were different personalities, but I really do think that correction of the headmaster's words were quite significant.
Son, you're under pressure. That's the pressure right now. The game down to a ground level. Both teams just.
Yeah, I've stopped. Right.
Sorry, I could hear something else coming through from another channel briefly.
Right. Yeah.
That's I mean, that's a very personal experience. That, are you suggesting it reflects a cultural moment, at least in the life of the churches that you were part of, that perhaps didn't quite capture the extent of the spiritual curiosity of people at that time? Did you think that framework was missing, if you like?
Yes, I think that's right. Because when the thing that really got Bruce going was that one of the members of his congregation set aside enough money for Bruce and Zandra, his wife, to go to England and sort of shop around, see what was being done, how was it different from what we were doing. It's things like that. And it was really quite important because it was when he got back from that trip that he started thinking about a group of people. We decided on, he brought me into it fairly early, and we decided on the label of Eremos because of what it referred to. And I think the poem from A.D. Hope was something that I focused on, and if you don't mind, I'd like to read the last two. Yet there are some like me turn gladly home from the lush jungle of modern thought to find the Arabian desert of the human mind, hoping if from the deserts the prophets come, such savage and scarlet as no green hills dare springs in that waste. Some spirit which escapes the learned doubt, the chatter of cultured apes, which is called civilization over there. And the contrast is between the savage and scarlet and the green hills. This is what struck me from rereading Hope, that what Eremos set out to do was to avoid the green hills of comfort and to tackle the more personal of what the faith was about. Singular in personal, of course, but also inclusive of other people, so that both aspects were being filled.
How did that yearning become strong or focused for you at that point in your own life, Don? That's an unscripted question, I know.
That's all right. I had not long been in the parish at Newtown, and so it would have been the late 80s or thereabouts, and I had come to think that I was just unhappy about so much of the way that the Diocese of Sydney worked. Moore College, I enjoyed being at Moore College to start with, because it was a serious attempt to understand at some depth what the faith was about. But as time went on, I got increasingly unhappy with the very narrow view of life that 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 church worked by, and I was increasingly unhappy with that. And that was why when Bruce came back, fired up with the thoughts of what we might do, I really took to it. So it came out of what I came to think of as a very narrow perspective into something much wider and much more inclusive.
Mm. That idea of boundaries and margins, which we've begun to talk about, is picked up in the idea of Eremos and the meaning of the word as a desert place or a wilderness. What did that idea mean to you? How did you understand what it meant to be on the margins at that time in the early 80s? What were you trying to include, I guess, that wasn't in view at that point?
Not to be too dogmatic. That really got my goat. When people talked like that or acted like that. To accept people in a more in a larger way. I think of a little incident that happened during my time there, and when Eremos had got underway, I was in the habit of opening the church. I don't know whether you know St. Stephen's Church.
Very well.
Right, okay. On a Saturday, I would sit in the church with the doors open, encouraging people to come in and look around. And while I thought about tomorrow's sermon, and I was sitting there down the back of the church, out of sight for people who didn't really know, and a group of children came in. And I thought, uh-oh, this is trouble. They looked as though age 9, 10, up to about 12. There were about, I think there were about 5 of them. So I sat there watching. They came in, they walked across to the aisle, they looked around, they walked up to the communion rail, they knelt, and I thought, you are an idiot, Meadows, expecting these people to be vandals or something. And then they tiptoed out of the church. And that stuck with me, because I thought, this is the way the place ought to run. People come in looking for something, and they enact that kind of role. And I'm sure they were quite serious about it. And they tiptoed out again. It just, it comes to my mind whenever I think about how the church ought to work and what can be done there. So yeah, so that's a little a little speck of what might happen. It bowled me over. It really did.
No, thank you for telling that story. I think it's easy to see why that experience would stay with a person for 40 years. It's incredibly moving.
Yeah.
as an image of the kind of space that an open door can lead to.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely right.
That idea of openness and inclusion and space for people to, well, to kneel. I mean, it's so profound, isn't it? To actually come to a point of communion and kneel together.
Yeah.
What do you see as the need for that now? I mean, the world is so different 40 years on. The state of the churches, the state of the nation, so much has changed. What do you see as the need for that kind of thing for a group like Eremos these days?
Well, I think that it's the extent. What Eremos did was to extend what was available and to bring in new things that had not been recognised. The weekends away were really at the head of the progress that we made. Being able to have access to the house up at, I can't think of the name of the place now, very well known beach on not far from where we live at the moment, in fact. Yeah, those weekends included all sorts of people. They came because they were interested. Some of them had long church backgrounds. There were others who hardly had anything at all in terms of that kind of experience, but whose curiosity had been aroused by the thought that there may be other things that are possible, and that they don't need to be bound by what a narrow kind of diocese would present. So that was very much part of what was going on.
Don, I'm not sure if you'd have imagined back then where things would be 40 years later, but I guess what in a way sounds like it started as a protest movement of sorts, if that's not to put it too strongly. I wonder, and I guess this is my last question for now.
Right.
Looking back on those 40 years and where this community, those weekends away, where this has taken you, I wonder if you could distill what Eremos has come to mean in your own life.
I read the magazine, which I think is going great guns, with really good people in charge. I read that, and most of the time I feel reinforced. Here are people. I was thinking specifically about one of the issues in the current Eremos, and Judith Keller wrote a discussion about a woman called Carol Kilby, whom I had not previously heard of. She's Canadian, and she's written this book titled Evolutionary Dancer, Out, In, and on the Fringe of the Church. And she's got some quite startling ideas in there. And I've asked the bookshop to get me a copy, and I look forward to reading it. But I think the emphasis is still on welcoming anybody, and that hasn't changed. But the one thing that I think is perhaps more of a question is, how does Eremos is Eremos constructed of older people? And when I say older, I mean, 60 plus. Or is there still a place for younger people, and I'm thinking of 20s upwards, to be part of what's on offer? And I'm not sure where we stand about that. But I think that's an impression that I have, that I would like to see. I would like to see people 40 years younger being part of the show. So there we go.
Well, thank you. I mean, Eremos is as old as me, so I didn't know so many of the stories you've just shared. But that question about what form would a desire for a more inclusive kind of communion take now, and what role might Eremos have to play in that as the generations go by? I hope that's one we can kind of think a bit about and dwell a little on this afternoon. But thank you so much, Don, for those stories and for what you've shared. I don't know, for me, it's obvious, but I suspect that for a lot of other people too, you've stirred a lot of recollections and reflections for people part of this meeting today. I do want to remind people the chat box is there, so please do post your questions, your answers if you have them, in the chat box as we spend this time together. Right. What we're going to do now is actually pause for a second and reflect on what Eremos has meant to many people here today. Ian is going to share a word cloud and some slides made up of comments that people submitted by email when they registered for this event, just to kind of capture the associations and words and ideas and feelings. I think sentiment is a huge part of it, about what Eremos has meant to people over these last 40 years. So take a moment, have a read, and just reflect on the story so far. We'll have more time this afternoon to continue thinking together. But thank you again, Don, for those words of experience and insight that you've shared this afternoon. We're going to move now into the second phase, if you like, of our journey together. We're going to move into a panel time now to reflect on some of these big themes of communion, of openness, inclusion, the search for spiritual significance, and how they take shape in the present. But to help us kind of prepare for that, we're going to have a reading to help draw our minds not only to the idea of a desert place, but also to the possibilities of spiritual transformation. Bethany is going to read a very well-known passage from the book of Exodus, the story of Moses and the burning bush, and then share a quote reflecting on that by the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Thank you, Bethany.
So this reading is from Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 14. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, who was the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he'd turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites, and the Amorites and the Perizzites, and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Moses, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Thus you will say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And now to contextualize this reading from the Hebrew Bible of our conversation today, we add this quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. When Moses at the burning bush says to God, Who are you? God says to him 3 words, Heya, Asher, Heya. And these words are mistranslated in English as I am that which I am. But in Hebrew, it means I will be who or how or where I will be, meaning don't think you can predict me. I am a God who is going to surprise you.
Thank you, Bethany. Well, if I can invite Ben and Celia to to join me. I mean, that is such a rich reading and a very helpful comment there from Rabbi Sachs. If I can begin with you, Celia, I mean, it's not a Bible study, but what stands out to you when you hear that read? What stands out to you?
Actually, it's a reading that matters a lot to me. But today, just listening to Don and thinking about what it takes to build something, and then coming at it from a polemic point of view, because that's what I do. I was thinking about strong stories and how do you have a strong story and hold diversity. And I think listening to it was that Moses was had such a strong story, and it was the God of the past, and the past story mattered and way back mattered. But then you have to take the strong story and be willing to be part of its change or its new, the newness of it. And that's really quite cruel in some ways. The very same people who hold ancient things and care back also have to be up for them being changed. And that, and how do you sit in the tension of that? And how do you hold, the desert is a place of lots of people with strong stories. So First Nations people have very strong stories. Any white fellow who lives here for any length of time probably has a strong story because it's such a strong landscape. You need one to hold you. So how do you hold lots of people with strong and varying stories together? That's where it took me.
Ben, do you have an initial thought or response? What arises for you when you hear that reading?
I thought earlier of how Dawn was telling the story of Bruce, and when Bruce just stood up and, draw the line, if you like, and I hear the echo of the passage that go, "Come no closer, come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet." There is something deeply holy about this mixture of hospitality and holy anger. It's very loving, but it's very radical because it's a divine voice. This is holy ground. I mean, that's something to say. And I come from, if you come into my home, in fact, in where I'm born in Malaysia, in Singapore, it doesn't matter if you're the king. When you come into the house, you take off your sandals. It doesn't matter who's home. You come in and you take off your sandals. It's holy ground. There's this reverence of, so something about that. Come no closer. This is holy ground. Very powerful. And I think that echo with what Dawn was saying was telling that story of Bruce. And I thought the story was about God, about love of God, about, it's interesting, very powerful.
Then you've begun to mention some of the places, if you like, that have been formative for you. Could I ask you to say a little bit more? I mean, given your upbringing in Malaysia, you've mentioned Singapore, about, I guess, the places that have become holy ground just in your own story.
I grew up in a really, really orthodox, conservative. And so I don't even know what those words really mean sometimes these days, but I think you understand what I'm saying. You came from a really strict, in some ways, maybe dogmatistic kind of growing up, really clear boundaries, Catholic Christian family. We come from my background, I come from a religious minority background. Catholics in Malaysia are a minority, even amongst Christians. And it's a multi-religious country. And you occupy liminal space at that point. You know that you are, you have to speak gently because people misunderstand you all the time. And then when I came here, and that's over 20 years ago, maybe, you have to speak even more gently because people really try to understand you. And I don't mean the English, I mean on many levels. When I came to came to understand who I am as a queer person, as a gay person, again, you have that needing people to understand. So you have this multi-layer of occupying really liminal spaces. So hospitality, it's something that you have to think about first. Not so much your hosts have to think about. You think about whether you be offered hospitality. It's constantly at the back of your mind. And I'm wondering about, being in the desert spaces. You have to ask that question, is it going to be hospitable? Is this route going to be hospitable? Is today going to be hospitable? And for those who are on the minoritized, marginalized spaces of our churches, of our temples, of our religious institutions, queer folks, women, people who see differently, hear differently from the heart. It's not the safest places to be. And religious trauma, it's part of the story of so many queer folks. I imagine if there's a royal commission into LGBTIQ lives, we would hear no end how those stories have been, it's on so many levels. So I think there's something about that. I do not know whether I'm answering your question, Meredith.
I'm thinking, thank you for sharing that, Ben. That's a gift in itself. Celia, if I can bring you in, you mentioned earlier that you moved to Central Australia partly in circumstances perhaps not of your own choosing, with an illness in play. How has that environment come to be significant for you in your own story, your own spirituality? I mean, we've begun to talk about, I guess, the way, well, you said before, the idea of the people becoming like the place that they inhabit. What could you elaborate on that dynamic, particularly in regards to the desert, the literal desert of Australia?
I was interesting listening to Benjamin, because I've often not fitted in either, but it's made me I think it's made him gentle and poetic and lovely, and it's made me internally spiky, so he might have done better out of that than me. Yeah, I think it gave me space to be who I was. So I'm a very complicated person. I grew up from very complicated people with, very strong, very well read, lots of ideas, but not the same ideas. Argument, you move continents because of disputes about your faith, that sort of thing. And I think what I was and what I was meant to be, I rose in institutions, and what you have to be to rise institutions and what I was didn't fit very well, and it almost broke me. And so first of all, it gave me space to sit with what I actually was, which wasn't particularly acceptable to me at the time, and to realise that you could hold all these contradictory ideas and be as strong as you were, or as smart as you were, or as vulnerable as you were. And the desert landscape can deal with all of it. It's such a, not impermeable, but sort of tough, indifferent sort of landscape in some ways. It doesn't really matter what you throw out at it. And so that, I think it matters to me to speak, I think. Because I was ill and I fell out of everything, I have a chronic pain condition. It's sort of highly stigmatized, really. Like, chronic pain's the worst. And in my worlds, it was the worst. And then I came to have more to do with First Nations folk, and they're stigmatized all the time in various ways too. And so when they spoke about it, it made sense to me. I was like, oh yeah, that's true, because I've experienced that myself in other ways. And it gave me time to sort of soak into some of that worldview. And I came to think that was the living edge of Christianity in Australia, and deeply excited. I loved it. I loved being around those circles and being on the edge of things. So that I came to find things that were more exciting than I'd ever thought possible. And one of the things First Nations folk do is they've got their own really strong stories, but then they come hoving across into the European story, and they often hold 3 or 4 stories at once that are not compatible, that they move between, and that's sort of what I'm like, actually. And so it gave me some models for what that might look like. And I think now I like the prophetic register and the prophetic voice. And now I'm trying to speak a bit like the desert, I think. So understate. This sounds a bit tossy, but you know, it's an understated sort of place. People are very blunt. It's not full of frills and furbelows. Things are placed and particular. People are what they are. They're not pretending to be something else. I really value that and moving among that. And I find that spacious for me. And I also like the desert. So I'm a bit of a lay monk sort of person. So I really like the Benedictine sort of rhythms and desert fathers and mothers and those sort of practices. So those monastic practices hold me, and I can understand myself living that way. And again, that's it's a desert thing to draw aside from the city and to do all these things to hold you as who you are. And really the institutions still matter the most in the end. You're just the little tiddly thing on the edge. But it does matter for some people to go and be that and see what comes. So,
Mum, we're talking about an idea of space as well as a physical space. And even listening to you, Celia, it's clear that there's a wilderness of the mind, perhaps, as well as a physical wilderness. And I mean wilderness in a generative sense rather than a barren one. Where do you see those open spaces existing in contemporary Australian culture? I'm interested in your thoughts too, obviously, Ben. Where is, I guess, given how urbanized we are, most of us, where is the wilderness with all its possibilities as you see it today?
So it sounds a bit mad, but small circles. So I think people who are honestly present with each other. So out of that institutional framework where you're all impressing each other, or you've got some line you have to run, or your speech has been bought in some way, or you're, the Anglican Church and you're splitting and everyone's speech is policed. So getting right out of that, and maybe people with spaciousness and honesty. Even that, I think people are really interesting, but they just hide it all the time. So I don't think you need to be in a desert, but you need held spaces where people are allowed to be the full complexity of who they are. And I think they're rare, actually, really, really rare. But I don't think, I think you could do them anywhere. But then you need people who are holding them, who are spacious enough to not die when they're disagreed with, or their pet theory is killed, or, it goes outside a doctrinal bound. And it takes quite a spaciousness in yourself to be able to do that. So something like that.
What are you thinking, Ben? That's obviously resonated with you.
No, I totally hear Celia. I think it's absolutely true. I'm thinking of where Celia is at. I'm only pretending that I'm in a desert, right? In this background, it looks incredibly confined. I'm in an office space. It's not very pretty, but I'm just thinking about cities are places of wilderness and deserts, because there is Thich Nhat Hanh, a wonderful Buddhist monk that I follow and I read, and he calls it the cult of individualism that have brought us the mess that we are in, of the 20th century. So even though we are living in such close proximity, what Celia was saying about the spaciousness, that truthfulness, there's not much of that hospitality. You could be living right next apartment. You might as well be in a desert all by yourself. Something about the needing for not just connection. Connection is one thing. Mindful connection of interbeing. That concept that you and me are completely correlated. Even though you might be we are completely related. Your well-being and my well-being are really, really related. So, I think something about that, unless we break out of that, and I think Australia has that opportunity to do that. You have the wealth of people. People don't talk about the wealth of people to form huge amount of camps like this that to come together, to camp together, to pitch tent next to each other. Thinking about the Gospel of John, the Word made flesh, pitch tent among us. we could stand next to each other rather than let's lock them up in some other hotels for 10 years because we do not know them. Or I think we have this wealth of holiness. We just really need to get out of it, break out of the worship of the individual.
I mean, it was Thich Nhat Hanh who, I think in English, coined the phrase into being. And that's been such a generative idea, I think, as the wisdom of those traditions has become better known in Anglophone communities. I mean, that was his great breakthrough in so many ways. But where do you see that hunger or yearning bubbling up? I think, I mean, it's so easy to ignore the prompts. I think our culture isn't always brave enough to broach these questions or pursue these impulses. I mean, you've both kind of, in different ways, crossed cultures. Where do you see that spiritual hunger or yearning arising in Australia now?
I think it's hard for the younger generation because of their presuppositions. So I think they want to be close to people, but they're not good at their own boundaries and barriers and rituals and some of the things that Eremos folk already had, and then they pulled out. Younger folk don't have it all. So they, but I think it's both in creation care and Indigenous voices is clearly really important to the next generation and is something that is really massively apparent here. So the landscape really does speak, and you can't but be here for 4 seconds and want to know how First Nations people connect with it. So I think there's those two. And then this is my slightly controversial third one. I think it's easier to come close to people when you have a bridge, right? And I think Scripture is a great bridge. And I also think things like ancient desert wisdom is a bridge. So to have something like that you can just dump on or hate or fight with or spike, but the thing that's bringing you together isn't you two necessarily agreeing to start with. So I think they actually want content and some of these old traditions, but they want to be free to explore it in their own way. And so the church is carrying the content and the stories, but I think it's not been particularly good at letting people remake them or explore them or argue with them or wrestle with them. So
that's a fascinating idea. I mean, Don talked about this idea of, is it a pursuit of the Bible or a pursuit of God? And you're kind of nuancing that, what might come across as a binary a little bit, by saying that the Bible, it might be a bridge if you can get the doctrine police to sit down for a minute. Is that a cavalier way of summarising what you mean? Yes,
and say with First Nations folk here, I mean, it's the reality here breaks everyone's presuppositions and all your own and everything. But, the Scripture's still a bridge here. It's been a bridge here for a really long time. And I actually wonder if the white fellas were so jolly corrupt when they came. Christianity was the only thing that they had that gave them a spiritual bridge across, right? Otherwise, they just were pastoralists with guns and land appropriation. But even now, so I do like a Bible study with Pitjantjatjara folk. It's the Bible and the hymns that are the bridge, the true bridge that enable us to meet together over something in common. And that's not what you'd think. Like, it's surprising that that's the way it is, but it is. And so I don't, well, I mean, it's the passion of my life, but I think it's useful. It's just, how do you, one of the difficulties I think for organisations like Eremos and my own background is that it becomes sort of upper class, say, it's more wealthy white folk, which has been my life too. And then how do you bridge to young Aboriginal Pentecostal inclined kids who are the people here? So you need things that can hold you across, but you also need,
That's a huge question, Celia. I mean, what bridges do you see in play, Benjamin, in the spheres that you're active in? Whether it's Scripture, it might be something completely different, I don't know. But what have you found actually works to make those marginal spaces meeting places, as you were saying earlier?
Hospitality. it's a discipline. Hospitality is a discipline. It's a practice. Anyone who has hosted anyone or been hosted by anyone would have to practice hospitality. You have to be inducted into that. You know, the religious spaces and the queer spaces, both sometimes find it very hard to, I think acceptance, sometimes it's a big word, tolerate someone like myself. Because it doesn't fit into those dualistic binary boxes. You require a lubricant, a medium, and something about hospitality, offering to sit down together for a meal. I think sometimes we in this country, we do use food a lot as a way of talking about multiculturalism. But I think there's something deeper that people are yearning for. They're yearning for, how do we do that hospitality? The food is just the product. And once you start talking and being together, this is the hospitality. How do you sit together and learn to have conversation together? And some of those things requires learning, and it requires elders to teach hospitality. I learn hospitality from my elders. We learn manners from our elders, but part of manners is hospitality too. How do we be welcoming and grateful spaces for one another, right? And I'm thinking of the religious folks that I work with, not from the Christian tradition, from other tradition, or Christian traditions who are, really struggling with this is gay Catholic here talking to them about theology, and they are like, they are offering hospitality, but the queer folk who is on the other end trying to engage, they are offering the same sacred hospitality. I'm thinking of 2017 during that horrible plebiscite that we were all subjected to. A lot of that hospitality was compromised. And I think that was the pain for many people, because we were trying to set the table together, and then we had to then see how we can vote in or vote out of this table. I mean, that's just very brutal. It's violence, right? So for me, I think Eremos, for example, and I'm so grateful that it's here still 40 years. And I think it's a long way more to go if this is what it is. If the desert space is this hospitality space, I think a lot of people would love to be there. And I see younger folks who already journey in these spaces. They just don't really know where the inroads are. And I think if I have a criticism of institutional faith, tradition, and religion, would be we have somehow failed to allow that to grow further than teaching people how to be more institutionalized. We today is the Feast of Pentecost. We have not given them the freedom to live in the freedom of the Spirit.
Can I add to that? I lived in this place called Campfire in the Heart, run by David and Sue Wood, for a long time, and they were really experts in hospitality, I'd say, really. And it's I came to see, I used to run a lot of retreats and do things with them, and it's very hard to do hospitality in that sort of way because there's no institution policing. So you get difficult people and fragile people and people who need help and complicate, things you have to deal with yourself outside institutional bounds. But I think the desert, you need wonderful hospitality because the desert is hard. So you'd have this wonderful, kind hospitality to hold people, and I think the land is also a common thing as well. So, everyone's on the same land, the land speaks in the same ways, the metaphors are universal. If you have a theology that's placed, the place is common. So those are lovely things. But then you're still grappling with the true thing, which is your own woe, the woe of the world, your brokenness, your complexity. And so you need hospitality, but not because it's all kind, because you need to be able to hold people with soft edges while they do really hard work, something like that. And if you're no good at hospitality, the whole thing's too cruel for words. But there's something that goes on while you're holding people, and that thing's still hard, I think, for people. And the crossing with First Nation, that interests me a lot. Crossing with Indigenous theologies is very hard. Like, it looks easy on the surface, but actually it's almost two incompatible worldviews. There's a lady here who told me that she just keeps the Aranda one in one spot in her head and the white fella one in another one, and she just teaches one or the other when she teaches the kids, because she can't, if she holds them together, it will sort of break her mind. And so you're asking people to cross into an incompatible worldview, and that's difficult. So what I'm thinking about, Benjamin, is listening to you, is how to use true language, which is, it's very hospitable and nice, but it also might break your brain at some point.
I think hardness is, it's very much part of hospitality. I think, and I agree with you totally, Celia. I think people might think that, sounds wonderful because of the word hospitality. Hospitality is hard. It's absolutely hard. If you have someone that is, utterly challenging in your space, or, you are trying to offer or you're trying to receive hospitality, it's very, very difficult, very, very painful. And sometimes you have to speak really hard truths. But I think that's where that little deposit of possibility of the divine is. If you allow yourself just that vulnerability to dare to speak truth with love, maybe. I know I'm trying to be naughty, maybe allow your heart to break a bit, and to listen to someone's heartbreak. Yeah.
I mean, for me, listening to each of you, I'm wondering about where you've described hospitality as a spiritual discipline, Benjamin, but Celia, you were talking about the range of disciplines, routines, practices, habits, the monastic elements of life that have been important to you. It makes me wonder about what role ritual and practice and all those wisdom raises. And I'm also looking at my clock thinking, we need to get up and have a stretch. And in a way, this is just what I'd hoped. We are going to just pause while our brains are exploding with this huge wealth of insight and experience and the possibilities and questions you've each raised. What we're going to do, and it feels like we're cutting it short, but in a way we're just shifting modes, is to take a little rest, have 5 minutes each of us to just collect our thoughts, have a stretch, make a cup of tea, and then we're all going to get in on this together in our breakout rooms, and I guess begin to mull over out loud together some of the things that we've been talking about so far today. So in a way, we're just taking a pause. We're going to have 5 minutes now, and Ian, while we're doing that, is going to create the breakout rooms. I'm asking if everybody could please be back in 5 minutes' time by 3:20 at the absolute latest. That's Sydney time, whatever your time zone is, in 5 minutes from now, and to think about what's been awakened for you from all that you've heard so far. Thank you, Ben and Celia. We'll take a short break.